Have you ever just looked at something happening in the world and thought, how could seemingly normal, decent people get involved in something so awful? It's a really tough question, right? And honestly, the answer is a lot more unsettling than just saying, oh, they're evil. So let's get into it, because what we're about to unpack is a kind of psychological trap that, frankly, any of us could fall into.
And this right here, this is the core of it. The real horror isn't just the bad act itself. It's the quiet conscience, the feeling of calm that people can have while they're doing it. It's like they're not even wrestling with the decision anymore, because they've already outsourced it. They actually feel at peace.
I know, right? How is it possible to do harm and feel fine? Or even worse, to feel like you're doing the right thing? Well, that's the mystery we're going to unravel. Because this isn't a story about monsters. It's a story about the psychological machinery that can lead good people down a very, very dark path.
Look, nobody wakes up one day and decides, I'm going to be the bad guy. It almost never starts like that. Instead, it's this quiet, gradual drift, and it's usually guided by two really powerful psychological forces that can basically hijack our moral compass and put it on autopilot. Let's break those down.
So you've got these two big drivers. First, there's obedience to authority. This is all about external pressure. You basically hand over your own sense of responsibility to someone else, a boss, a system, a leader. It's that classic excuse, hey, I was just following orders. But then there's the internal pressure, identity and group loyalty. And this one is powerful. This is where a belief stops being just an idea you have and becomes part of who you are. So if someone attacks the belief, it feels like they're attacking you. Let's dig into that first one for a second. The famous Milgram experiments showed this perfectly. You had ordinary people who were told by a guy in a lab coat to give what they thought were incredibly painful electric shocks to another person. And a terrifying number of them just did it. They kept going all the way to the highest voltage, not because they were sadistic, but because the authority figure told them to. They started seeing themselves as just an instrument, a tool, and the real responsibility, well, that was on the guy in charge. And then we've got the second one, identity. You know, when who you are gets all tangled up with what your group believes, your brain just flips a switch. It goes from investigation mode to defense mode. You stop asking, hey, is this actually true? And you just start defending the idea at all costs. You don't engage with the criticism, you just reject the critic. Because if you let go of that belief, it feels like you're losing a part of yourself. Okay, so you can see how someone might get started down a bad road. But what happens when they see clear evidence that they're wrong? You'd think that would be the moment they'd stop, right? Well, not exactly. There's this incredibly powerful glitch in our thinking called cognitive dissonance, and it explains why, instead of backing down, people so often just double down. This is a classic real-world example that just lays it all out. So you have a doomsday cult. They've sold their homes, quit their jobs, all because they believe the world is ending on Tuesday. Then Wednesday morning comes and everything's fine. Now, imagine that intense mental stress, that conflict between your belief and plain-as-day reality. The easiest way to relieve that tension isn't to admit, wow, I was catastrophically wrong. No, it's to change the story. So they conclude their faith was so powerful, it actually saved the world. See? They didn't just stick to their belief, they made it even stronger.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. You might be listening to all this and thinking, okay, that's what happens to other people, gullible people. I'm too smart for that. But I've got to warn you, that's a really dangerous trap to fall into.
Yeah, this is a tough one to swallow, but it's so important. Being smart is not a defense against this stuff. In fact, it can actually make you more susceptible. Why? Because the smarter you are, the better you are at building complex, sophisticated, and really convincing arguments to justify what you already believe. Your intelligence becomes a tool for rationalization. You basically become an expert at fooling yourself.
And this isn't just some theory. I mean, just look at the Enron scandal. That company wasn't staffed by idiots. It was packed with brilliant MBAs from the best schools. But all that brainpower was used to justify massive fraud, not to question it. The culture of loyalty was so intense that if you raised a doubt, you were seen as disloyal, not a team player. And slowly, bit by bit, things that were wildly illegal just started to feel normal. Just another day at the office. So, if our deference to authority, our loyalty to our group, and even our own intelligence can lead us so far astray, what's the fix? How do we fight back against this quiet drift into wrongdoing? Well, the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who studied this very thing, she offered an antidote.
It sounds almost laughably simple, right? Just think. But what she meant wasn't just letting thoughts float around in your head. She meant actively engaging in an internal conversation with yourself. It means you have to deliberately hit pause on that mental autopilot and start asking some really tough questions.
And this is the first one, the big one. You just have to stop and ask yourself, straight up, is this belief really mine? Or did I just kind of absorb it from my job, my friends, my political party, without ever really kicking the tires?
Okay, now here's the pressure test. Imagine you had to explain and defend this belief to someone smart who totally disagrees with you, someone outside of your bubble. How would your arguments hold up? Or do they only really make sense when you're surrounded by people who already agree with you?
And this might be the hardest one of all. It takes real intellectual humility. You have to ask yourself, am I looking for the truth, or am I just looking for confirmation for what I already think? Because being truly open to the possibility that you are wrong is maybe the best defense we have against this kind of self-deception.
And that's the key takeaway here. The point of seeking out people who disagree with you isn't necessarily to agree with them. It's a strategic move. It's like hiring a quality control inspector for your own brain. They help you find the weak spots in your own thinking before they grow into something much, much worse.
So, that really leaves us with one final thought, a question to ask ourselves. It's always easy to see these kinds of blind spots in other people, isn't it? The real work is finding them in ourselves. So, take a second. What's one thing in your life right now that you find yourself constantly defending when maybe you should be examining it instead? Finding the answer to that might just be the thing that keeps you on the right path.
Welcome to the debate. Usually when we talk about a catastrophic failure, say a suspension bridge collapsing, we look for a dramatic, visible rupture.
Right. We want to find a snapped primary cable or, a massive seismic shock. Some clear point of structural trauma.
Exactly. We expect the cause of the disaster to be as obvious and, loud as the disaster itself.
It is a very natural human expectation. We want the origin of destruction to be identifiable. We want it to look like a monster.
But structural engineers know that the most insidious danger is actually microscopic. It's metal fatigue. It is a tiny, invisible stress fracture that spreads over years, completely silently, under the strain of normal, everyday traffic. The structure looks perfectly sound to the naked eye, until one day the entire thing just gives way.
And, human morality operates in exactly the same way. The most devastating ethical failures in our history, the truly catastrophic harms, are rarely the result of some dramatic, villainous rupture in a person's character. They're the product of moral metal fatigue.
Precisely. So today, we're arguing over the true cause of this moral collapse. How is it that the most dangerous evil isn't committed by obvious villains, but by ordinary people who simply, stop thinking for themselves?
Right. When examining how so-called good people end up participating in immense harm, we have to ask, what is the primary driver?
Exactly. Is this failure fundamentally an internal lapse, like a surrender of individual cognitive responsibility? Or is it an inevitable psychological surrender to external social structures? I will argue that the root cause, and ultimately the only reliable antidote, lies strictly within the individual's capacity for independent thought and moral reflection. The failure is, at its core, a cognitive choice to stop asking, is this right?
And I will argue that the overwhelming power of environmental structures, forces like authority, identity, and group loyalty, essentially neutralize that individual cognition. People do not consciously choose to stop thinking. Rather, systemic forces literally rewrite their reality and shift their self-perception, making individual reflection practically impossible. The system is the true driver of ordinary harm.
Let's start with Hannah Arendt's profound analysis of Adolf Eichmann, which is really the bedrock for understanding this. When Arendt went to Jerusalem to cover Eichmann's trial for his role in the Holocaust, she didn't find a raving psychopathic monster.
No, she found a terrifyingly mundane bureaucrat.
Right, a guy who spoke in corporate cliches. He was able to commit horrific acts without hatred, without guilt, and sometimes without even basic awareness, simply because he was treating those acts as, quote, part of the job. Arendt identified the danger as a quiet, gradual drift.
Individuals actively avoid uncomfortable questions. They align with group norms. They defer decisions. Notice the verbs there: avoiding, aligning, deferring. These are actions. They imply individual agency. The failure is an intellectual one. It's the choice to use your mind to execute a task rather than to examine the morality of the task itself.
I come at it from a different way. When you emphasize words like avoiding or deferring, you are framing them as conscious, deliberate choices made in a vacuum. But no one operates in a vacuum. Let's look at the corporate collapse of Enron.
Okay, let's look at it.
It is a perfect modern parallel. Enron wasn't just a collection of isolated, inherently corrupt individuals who woke up and decided to avoid questions. They were operating within an intensely engineered environment. Look at the mechanics of Enron's rank and yank system. Every single year, the bottom 15% of employees were systematically fired.
Wow, yeah, that's a brutal system.
Exactly. Your survival, your mortgage, your identity, it all depended on pleasing the person above you and hitting arbitrary financial targets. In that environment, doubt isn't just discouraged, it is actively punished. Over time, that structural pressure normalizes the wrongdoing. It isn't that they're choosing to do evil, it's that the baseline of what constitutes reality, like what is considered a normal business practice, has been entirely rewritten by the social structure.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I completely agree that the Enron culture was a meat grinder. It put immense pressure on the individual. But my point is this: a meat grinder doesn't work if the gears refuse to turn.
But the gears are people, and they are under threat.
Yes, but even in a highly coercive environment, the individual still possesses the internal mechanism of reason. The moral drift happens in micro steps. Someone defers a decision to an aggressive boss today. They align with a slightly questionable accounting trick tomorrow. Every single time an executive falsified a ledger or hid debt in a shell company, they had to actively suppress their conscience to do it.
You think it was active suppression every time?
I do. The environment might offer the path of least resistance, but it is the individual who decides to stop walking uphill. The horror of Eichmann, or, an Enron executive, is not that the system forced them to act. The horror is that they simply accepted the system's premises without subjecting them to their own internal scrutiny.
But if we accept that the environment exerts this massive gravitational pull, it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question about human psychology. Why do smart people accept those premises? You would think that high intelligence is the ultimate defense against this drift, but the historical and psychological data shows the exact opposite.
Yes, and that actually strengthens my position regarding individual cognitive responsibility. It's fascinating. Smarter, highly capable people are often more vulnerable to this moral fatigue. I would offer an analogy here. Intelligence, in this context, acts like a highly sophisticated, incredibly expensive defense attorney representing a guilty client.
Okay, how so?
Well, the attorney's job isn't to seek the objective truth. The attorney's job is to defend the client. And in this psychological scenario, the client is the ego, the identity, or the actions the person has already taken. The smarter you are, the better your internal lawyer is at rationalizing decisions and defending conclusions rather than questioning them.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
Right? A brilliant accountant at Enron doesn't tell themselves they're committing fraud. Their internal lawyer constructs an elaborate, legally complex justification for why it's actually innovative mark-to-market accounting. Or a bureaucrat justifies a horrific policy as necessary for the greater good. This proves that the mind is the primary battleground. The failure is that individuals aim their vast intellect toward rationalization rather than genuine inquiry. It is an active misuse of cognitive power.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The lawyer analogy assumes a level of calculating detached cognitive strategy. It makes it sound like a chess game.
It is a cognitive process, though.
But when we look at the mechanics of cognitive dissonance, we realize it isn't about intellect at all. It is about sheer psychological survival. Think about Leon Festinger's study of the doomsday cult in the 1950s. This perfectly illustrates the point. This group truly believed a UFO was coming to rescue them at midnight before the world ended. They quit their jobs. They sold their houses. They completely anchored their identity to this belief.
And then midnight came and went.
Exactly. Midnight passes, then 2 a.m., then 4 a.m. Reality unequivocally contradicts their worldview. If the intellect is just a clever defense attorney, you would expect them to quietly rationalize a mistake and go home. But they didn't. They doubled down. By morning, they were hitting the streets handing out flyers, claiming their group's faith had actually saved the world.
Because they reinterpreted the events to preserve their worldview.
Which is exactly the intellectual rationalization I am talking about.
But the mechanism driving it isn't intellectual strategy, it's existential panic. Cognitive dissonance causes actual psychological pain. The intellectual realization of, I ruined my life for a lie is biologically unbearable. When reality threatens the foundation of your identity, you don't engage in high-level intellectual defense, you engage in a primal reflex. You warp reality to alleviate the pain of being wrong.
Well, if you're listening to this right now, you're probably thinking, I would never blindly double down on a lie like that. We all think that. But doubling down isn't a sign of stupidity. It's an evolutionary painkiller. The intellect isn't a lawyer. It is a hostage to the emotional need for identity preservation.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I don't deny the psychological pain of cognitive dissonance, but recognizing that pain for what it is, a blaring alarm system signaling that your beliefs are out of alignment with reality, is precisely the intellectual duty we are talking about.
But it doesn't feel like an alarm. It feels like an attack.
Yes, but the fact that the Doomsday Cult members felt that pain and chose to aggressively reinterpret reality rather than accept the truth is the ultimate failure of independent thinking. They allowed the emotional pain of dissonance to override their reason.
You are demanding a level of cognitive detachment that contradicts everything we know about human nature. If questioning the group feels like a literal threat to your survival, your biological response is to neutralize the threat, not to invite it in for a cup of tea and a debate. You're asking someone to commit psychological suicide just to maintain independent thought.
And yet, if we abandon the expectation of that cognitive detachment, we abandon the only viable solution to ordinary evil. This leads us directly to the antidote. If we understand why this drift happens, we have to establish how to stop it. Hannah Arendt proposed a solution that is incredibly simple in concept, but immensely difficult in practice: the pause.
Yes, the famous pause for reflection.
Exactly. It's the active, deliberate insertion of a wedge between the stimulus of the environment and your own response. It requires pausing to ask yourself, do I actually believe in what I am doing? If I stepped outside of my corporate culture or my political group or my inner circle, would I still defend this action? Am I open to the possibility that I'm completely wrong?
That requires a huge amount of self-awareness.
It does. And most importantly, it requires actively seeking out opposing views, not to debate them or defeat them, but to prevent your own self-deception. I frame this as the ultimate intellectual responsibility. It requires a conscious refusal to let your intellect act merely as that rationalizing defense attorney.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the terrifying reality of the psychological state we are actually dealing with? We have to evaluate the practicality of Arendt's pause against how the human brain actually processes authority. The most disturbing part of ordinary evil isn't the wrongdoing itself. It is the peace people feel while doing it.
I'm not sure peace is the right word. We literally just talked about the extreme pain of cognitive dissonance.
The pain happens when there is a conflict, but when the system works perfectly, there is no conflict. Let's look at the mechanics of Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s. Ordinary people were brought into a lab and told to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to another person. We all know the setup.
Right.
But think about how it worked. The experimenter didn't yell. He didn't threaten them. He just stood there in a gray lab coat and calmly said, "The experiment requires that you continue." It's that clinical bureaucratic framing that flips a switch in the subject's brain. They stop evaluating the morality of the shock, and they start evaluating how well they are complying with the lab protocol. The metric of goodness changes from, am I hurting someone, to, am I doing my job correctly?
They shifted the responsibility upward.
Yes, and in doing so, their self-perception fundamentally shifted. They no longer saw themselves as moral agents or decision makers. They saw themselves merely as instruments of the authority figure. And here's the crucial point. An instrument does not experience the friction required to pause. A hammer does not question whether the nail should be driven.
But human beings aren't hammers.
No, but they function like them in these systems. If you're an Enron executive who is fully integrated into a culture that rewards loyalty, or a Milgram subject who has successfully shifted responsibility to the scientist, the wrongdoing feels normal. You only pause when you feel friction. If the environment has successfully eliminated the friction, the trigger to ask, is this right, never fires.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it implies that this false justified peace is a permanent, impenetrable state. It's not. Even in Milgram's experiments, the subjects experienced severe distress. They sweated, they stuttered, they nervously laughed. They knew on some level that what they were doing was wrong. The distress proves that the internal moral compass was still functioning. It was buried, but it was there.
But they still pulled the lever. The structure won.
Yes, they pulled a lever because they made the choice to subordinate their compass to the authority figure. The antidote of independent thinking is not meant to be a reactionary emergency brake that you only pull when you suddenly feel guilty. It's meant to be a daily, disciplined habit. Errant solution, asking if you would defend your actions outside your group, is a deliberate exercise you must undertake precisely because you might feel at peace inside the group.
But asking someone who is profoundly embedded in an identity-driven worldview to actively seek opposing views is like asking a fish to analyze the water. The water is all they know. If their entire identity is built on rejecting critics instead of engaging them, they simply will not do it. The psychological structure actively defends against errant's solution.
I am not arguing that it is easy. The friction of doubt is deeply uncomfortable. But difficulty does not negate necessity. If we accept your premise that the environment completely neutralizes individual reflection, we essentially absolve every single participant in Enron, every obedient subject in Milgram studies, and ultimately Adolf Eichmann himself of moral responsibility.
I wouldn't say absolve.
We just blame the structure. The culture made me do it. But the very premise of this phenomenon is that these are ordinary people committing harm. And if ordinary people have the capacity to commit it, ordinary people have the capacity to stop it. The mechanism to stop it is the individual mind choosing to engage in the friction of doubt.
Look, I am absolutely not absolving them of responsibility. I am trying to accurately describe the machinery of their failure. If we just throw our hands up and say, well, they should have thought more independently, we are ignoring the profound scientifically documented psychological forces that make independent thought nearly impossible in those moments.
I see your point.
The value of understanding Milgram and the doomsday cults and the corporate meat grinders is recognizing that human rationality is incredibly fragile. It shatters under the weight of authority and identity. If we want to prevent ordinary people from doing harm, we have to engineer environments that don't force them into blind obedience in the first place. We cannot just rely on the hope that they will miraculously pause and philosophize when the system is screaming at them to conform.
But we cannot engineer a perfect environment. There will always be authoritative pressures, there will always be a boss demanding you cut corners, or a political tribe demanding your absolute loyalty. Therefore, the final line of defense must always inevitably be the individual mind.
The final line of defense is undeniably human nature, but history shows us how easily human nature is co-opted.
As we draw this discussion to a close, it is essential to summarize where we stand on this profoundly challenging issue. My position remains that combating destructive compliance requires relentless individual vigilance. The descent into ordinary evil is a gradual drift fueled by the avoidance of uncomfortable questions and the misuse of intelligence to rationalize bad choices. The only way to arrest this drift is through intellectual charity, the courage to seek opposing views, and the disciplined practice of Arendt's pause to prevent the mind's descent into self-deception.
And my summary is that while independent thought is obviously the ideal, we must recognize our profound psychological vulnerability. We are not purely rational actors detached from our surroundings. We are deeply susceptible to authority.
and our identities are intimately bound up in group loyalty. When cognitive dissonance strikes, our primary biological drive is to preserve our worldview, often at the expense of reality. We must understand the overwhelming structural and systemic forces that drive ordinary harm if we're to have any hope of mitigating it.
Yet I believe we both acknowledge a point of deep convergence here. The most disturbing element of this entire phenomenon is not the mechanics of the wrongdoing itself.
No, it is the peace, the terrifying tranquility of the surrendered mind. When an individual has fully handed over their moral judgment to an authority figure or fully fused their identity with a group, they can participate in catastrophic harm while feeling completely justified. They don't lose sleep, they just go to work. It's a haunting realization about the human condition.
It absolutely is, and it reflects the necessity of holding both of our perspectives in tension. We must deeply understand our systemic vulnerabilities and the psychological mechanisms that threaten to rewrite our reality, but at the same time we must strive relentlessly for the ideal of independent thought. There is certainly much more to explore regarding exactly how identity fundamentally shapes our belief systems. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the balance of individual responsibility against structural influence for yourself.
It is a balance we all have to navigate every single day.
Indeed. Think back to that bridge we discussed at the beginning. The metal fatigue doesn't announce itself. It's completely silent. It is excruciatingly slow. The structure seems perfectly sound, right up until the moment it isn't. So the question we must leave you with is this. If moral drift is completely silent and the failure of independent thought feels exactly like peace, well, how do you know if your own foundation is already fracturing?
This is the brief on the psychology of everyday evil. You know, the most dangerous evil doesn't actually come from cartoonish villains. It comes from ordinary people who just stop thinking for themselves, treating absolute horrors as, well, part of the job. It's exactly what philosopher Hannah Arendt observed with Adolf Eichmann. First, we've got to recognize the conformity trap. People naturally shift responsibility upward. Think about the Milgram experiments, right? Ordinary folks giving what they thought were lethal shocks just because a guy in a lab coat said so. We tie our beliefs to our group, defending actions instead of really examining them. So, are we seriously just treating morality like a corporate chain of command? Second, the intelligence paradox. You'd think a big brain is a shield against bad behavior, right? Nope. Turns out it's often just a better excuse generator. Look at the highly educated executives behind the massive Enron fraud. When reality hit, they faced cognitive dissonance. Instead of fixing their mistakes, they just used those big brains to rationalize bad decisions and double down. Finally, we need the antidote: independent thought. We have to literally pause, actively seek opposing views, and ask ourselves uncomfortable questions, like, am I open to being wrong? It stops that quiet drift into self-deception. Putting your conscience on autopilot feels peaceful, sure, but it's going to lead to a catastrophic crash. Ultimately, the most disturbing part of wrongdoing isn't the malice, but the terrifying peace people feel when they hand over their moral compass to someone else.
You know, we all walk around with this movie playing in our heads.
Yeah, the one where we're the hero.
Exactly. Where we are inevitably the good guy. I mean, if we were placed in some grand historical test of morality, we like to think we'd be the one standing up.
Right. Speaking out, resisting the villain.
Yeah, it's comforting, right? It's a very clean, binary way of looking at the world. Good guys over here, bad guys over there.
It makes things simple.
But today, we are looking at data and historical analysis that completely, just totally shatters that narrative.
It really does.
We are diving into a reality where the smartest people in the room are actually, well, the most likely to commit catastrophic moral failures. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are so glad you're here with us.
Glad to be here.
We're pulling from a truly fascinating stack of research today, drawing heavily on the philosophy of Hannah Arendt, decades of behavioral science, and some of the most infamous case studies in modern history.
And the mission of our discussion today really is to deconstruct a rather terrifying reality. The worst acts aren't committed by those obvious, mustache-twirling villains we just mentioned.
Right.
They're committed by completely ordinary people who simply stop thinking, people who are just trying to get through their Tuesday.
Which is such a wild concept. And we are going to break down the psychological mechanics behind how this actually happens.
We have to.
Because we'll explain why, contrary to literally everything you might assume, Having a high IQ or an advanced degree or being a quote-unquote critical thinker actually makes you significantly more vulnerable to this trap.
Which is the exact opposite of what we're taught.
Exactly. And we will outline the very strict daily antidote required to stop this cognitive drift. Because the research shows us something quite chilling.
Yeah, it really is chilling.
Your everyday desire to simply fit in, just to do your job, might be exactly what paves the way for the most destructive actions imaginable.
What's fascinating here is that we are looking at the invisible architecture of complicity.
The invisible architecture. I like that phrase.
We need to understand how the human mind reorganizes its own morality to survive social pressure and institutional momentum.
Because nobody wakes up deciding to be the bad guy.
Right.
Okay, so let's unpack this by starting with what we're calling the obvious villain myth.
Good place to start.
The foundational work we are looking at draws on Hannah Arendt's analysis of Adolf Eichmann. Now, he was one of the major bureaucratic organizers of the Holocaust.
Yes, a key figure.
And Arendt's core observation, which, by the way, deeply upset people at the time, was that someone can participate in horrific, unimaginable acts without harboring a deep, seething hatred.
Or feeling crippling guilt.
Right. And without even a true active awareness of what they are doing. Simply by treating the atrocities as part of the job.
Part of the job, yeah.
Now, I have to stop right here because I struggle to buy that.
Tell me why. Let's dig into that skepticism a bit.
Well, as an observer, just looking at human nature, I get our cultural obsession with dramatic movie villains. The Joker, Darth Vader. Characters who act out of pure malice or, a desire to watch the world burn. That is what we are taught evil looks like.
It's the standard template.
But this mundane reality is almost harder to swallow. I mean, if you are literally coordinating trains that are carrying human beings to their deaths, your eyes and ears are processing suffering.
You're seeing the paperwork at the very least.
Exactly. You can't just admin that away. Are you telling me their biological empathy just switches off?
Well,
how is it psychologically possible to feel absolutely no guilt while participating in horrors? Is this an active, exhausting suppression of guilt? Or do they genuinely, truly not see the blood on their hands?
that right there is the crucial distinction. And it's exactly why Arndt's observations during Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem were so incredibly shocking to the public.
Because they wanted a monster.
Exactly. People wanted a monster. They wanted him to be frothing at the mouth, radiating pure hatred. But he was just a bureaucrat.
Middle manager.
Right. A middle manager. And to answer your question, no, it is not an act of suppression.
It's not.
No, because active suppression implies an internal conflict, right? It implies you know what you are doing is monstrous, but you are forcing yourself to ignore the guilt.
Which takes immense psychological energy.
Massive amounts of energy. What the behavioral science and arts philosophy highlight is a state where the guilt never even forms in the first place.
Wait, never forms? Because the brain categorizes the action differently.
Precisely. Think about that phrase, doing things as part of the job.
Yeah.
When you compartmentalize your actions into the realm of administration or duty, you apply a completely different set of metrics to evaluate your own success.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
The metric is no longer, is this action inherently good or bad for humanity?
Right.
The metric becomes, did I file this paperwork correctly? Did I route these trains on schedule?
Did I meet the logistical quota my supervisor set for me?
Exactly. Am I a good employee?
So, if the metric of success changes from morality to efficiency, the brain doesn't trigger a guilt response.
Because it doesn't see a reason to.
Because according to these new parameters, you haven't done anything wrong. You've actually done a quote-unquote good job.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, treating morality as an administrative task completely neutralizes awareness.
It's like building a wall in your head.
It really is.
Yeah.
The individual builds an impenetrable psychological firewall between their personal morality, how they treat their family, their friends, their pets at home, and their professional or systemic output.
That is wild.
They genuinely do not see the end result of their actions as something they caused. They merely passed the paper from the inbox to the outbox.
They optimized a spreadsheet.
Exactly. They didn't cause the suffering. The system caused the suffering. They just made the system run on time.
It's the ultimate fragmentation of the self.
Yes.
The man at home who loves his children is fundamentally walled off from the man at the desk who is destroying families.
That's the terrifying reality of it.
So if malicious frothing hatred isn't what drives good people to do harm, what are the actual psychological engines at work here?
Well, this brings us to a massive concept in the research, the upward shift of responsibility.
Right. If you aren't operating on malice, you are likely operating on obedience.
Exactly. The psychological driver here is obedience to authority.
Okay.
When people are following orders, they instinctively shift the moral responsibility upward.
Which makes sense, logically.
The classic, most definitive example of this in behavioral science is the Milgram experiment.
Oh, I know this one. This is the electric shock study from the 1960s at Yale.
That's the one.
We need to really get into the weeds of this because the details are what make it so terrifying.
Go for it.
So you have subjects come in thinking they are doing a memory test.
Yeah.
They're told by an authority figure, a guy in a gray lab coat with a clipboard, very official looking too, administer electric shocks to another person in the next room every time that person gets a question wrong.
Right.
And the voltage goes up with every wrong answer.
Yes. And the control panel they were using wasn't subtle at all.
No, it was explicitly marked.
It started at 15 volts, labeled slight shock, and went all the way up to 450 volts.
Which is massive.
And that 450 mark was labeled with ominous red text, danger severe shock, and finally, just XXX.
Just XXX. And the person in the other room,
Uh-huh.
who, we should clarify, was an actor, not actually getting shocked.
Right, they were perfectly safe.
But the subject didn't know that. So the actor would start grunting, then shouting, then literally screaming in agony, begging to be let out, complaining of a heart condition.
He was incredibly dramatic.
And eventually, if they kept going, the actor would just go completely, horrifyingly silent.
Implying they were unconscious or worse.
And yet, the subjects kept pressing the button.
A massive percentage of them did. Over 65% went to the absolute maximum voltage.
That is just so hard to wrap my head around.
But the key takeaway here isn't just the horrifying fact that they obeyed. It's the nuance of why they obeyed.
Because they weren't enjoying it.
Right. Not at all. If you watch the footage of these experiments, these subjects were not sadists. They were sweating profusely. They were trembling, biting their lips, groaning.
I read that some were digging their fingernails into their own flesh.
Exactly. They were under immense psychological distress. But they continued.
Why?
They continued because they viewed themselves strictly as instruments, not as decision makers. They entered what Milgram called the agentic state.
The agentic state. Let's bring this into a modern, relatable context for everyone listening.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because you and I, and the person listening right now, we aren't participating in historic atrocities or electric shock experiments.
Hopefully not.
But we do work in hierarchies. We all exist in systems with bosses.
Absolutely.
I think about this like passing the buck in a corporate environment. You see an issue with a product or a slightly shady accounting practice or a toxic HR policy.
A very common scenario.
And you say, look, I just ran the numbers. My boss approved the project. It's above my pay grade. You mentally clock out of the moral implication.
That corporate analogy is perfectly aligned with the mechanism. The psychological safety of shifting responsibility upward is immense.
It protects you.
It protects the ego from a heavy burden of consequence. When the subjects in Milgram's experiment hesitated, the researcher in the lab coat would simply say, "The experiment requires that you continue."
Or I will take responsibility.
Exactly. I will take responsibility. And you could visibly see the relief wash over the subjects.
Well,
The moment the authority figure absorbed the responsibility, the subject felt free to keep pressing the button.
I still struggle with this, though.
How so?
Well, at some point, doesn't the instrument realize what it's building?
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm handing bricks to a mason, eventually I step back and see the wall.
Okay, I see your point.
Even if I say my boss is responsible, I am still the physical person pushing the 450-volt button while a man screams. Why does the upward shift of responsibility completely blind the individual to the final physical product of their actions?
Because of the profound difference between the psychology of a decision maker and an instrument.
Great, unpack that.
A decision maker possesses agency, and with agency comes the psychological weight, the biological stress of the outcome.
Because it's on you.
Right. An instrument has no agency. Think of a hammer.
A hammer.
A hammer does not feel guilty for the beautiful house that is built, nor does it feel guilty for the window that is smashed during a riot.
It's just doing what it's used for.
Exactly. When a human being successfully adopts the mindset of an instrument, successfully stripping away their own agency, they simultaneously strip away the psychological burden of the outcome.
That is so dark.
They tell themselves, I am not the author of this action. I am merely the pen.
I am merely the pen. Wow. That is a chilling way to frame it.
It is.
And you can see why it's so seductive, the sheer relief of not having to be responsible.
It is incredibly seductive. It takes an enormous amount of cognitive energy to constantly evaluate the morality of a complex system.
To constantly weigh the ethical implications of your 9-to-5 job.
Right. Surrendering your agency to an authority figure is quite literally the path of least psychological resistance.
Your brain just wants a break.
Your brain wants to conserve energy, so it delegates the moral heavy lifting to the guy with the clipboard.
Okay, so authority figures offer us one very clear way to surrender our moral judgment. We just hand the steering wheel to the boss, or the government, or the algorithm.
Yes.
But the research outlines a second mechanism. And this one is arguably more insidious because it doesn't require a boss or a dictator at all.
It doesn't.
It's a completely internal mechanism that happens when we tie our beliefs to our tribe. It's a fusion of identity and group loyalty.
This is where the psychology gets deeply personal and incredibly relevant to our modern digital lives.
Oh, absolutely.
The research points out that when our beliefs become intertwined with our identity, questioning those beliefs no longer feels like an intellectual exercise.
What does it feel like?
It feels like a literal physical threat.
I see this constantly. You can see it in how insanely defensive people get over their favorite sports teams or their dietary lifestyle choices.
Plus politics.
Or even the brand of smartphone they use. But let's dig into the biology of this.
Okay.
Why does a challenge to a concept, an abstract belief about tax policy or a movie review, trigger the exact same defensive, fight-or-flight physiological response as a physical threat?
That's a great question.
Like, why does reading a comment section make our heart race and our palms sweat like we're being chased by a predator?
This raises a vital point about human evolution. We are, at our core, social primates.
Right.
For 99% of human history, belonging to a group was not a luxury. It was a matter of physical survival.
Because if you were alone, you died.
Exactly. If you disagreed with the tribe and were exiled, you didn't just feel lonely. You starved or you were eaten.
Wow.
Therefore, the brain wires group loyalty directly into the amygdala, the deepest survival instinct.
An alarm system.
Right. What the behavioral data highlights is the extreme danger of fusion when what I believe becomes completely indistinguishable from who I am and who my people are.
So the belief isn't just an idea I hold in my hand, like a tool I can put down?
No, not at all.
It's an appendage. It's my arm or my leg. And if you attack the idea, my brain literally registers that you are attacking my body.
Precisely. The brain doesn't differentiate between you are attacking my stance on healthcare and you are coming at me with a spear.
That explains so much of the internet.
It really does. And the research outlines two specific devastating outcomes of this identity trap.
What are they?
First, people end up defending beliefs instead of examining them. They act as lawyers for their pre-existing conclusions, rather than scientists looking for truth.
Just fighting to win the case.
Exactly. And second, they reject critics instead of engaging them.
Let's focus on that second outcome. Rejecting critics instead of engaging them.
Okay.
This means the actual substance of what the critic is saying doesn't even matter.
It rarely matters in those moments.
Like, the critic could be standing there holding a spreadsheet with undeniable, peer-reviewed, mathematical proof that a policy is failing.
Right.
But because the critic is an outsider, or because the facts threaten the group's narrative, the brain just slams the gate shut.
Yes, because engaging the critic in good faith would require objective evaluation.
And what's the danger there?
Objective evaluation holds the terrifying risk of discovering that your group might be wrong. If your group is wrong, your status within that group, or the group status in society, is threatened.
Which goes back to the survival instinct.
Exactly. So group loyalty completely short-circuits independent thought because belonging to the group is unconsciously prioritized over objective truth.
Truth doesn't keep you warm at night. The tribe does.
Well said. The truth becomes entirely secondary to tribal cohesion.
Okay, but this fusion of identity and belief is so powerful. You would think that eventually reality would just crash through the door.
You would hope so.
Like, you can ignore the spreadsheet for a while, but eventually the bridge collapses. The truth has to win out in the end, right?
Not necessarily.
But the source material says no. In fact, it says that even when reality provides undeniable physical proof that the group is wrong, people don't wake up.
They don't.
They actually dig in deeper.
They double down.
Yeah.
And the most vivid illustration of this in the psychological literature is Leon Festinger's study on cognitive dissonance.
Oh, The book When Prophecy Fails.
Yes, particularly his work in that book.
This is the doomsday cult study from the 1950s. This is absolute psychological gold.
It's a classic for a reason.
Let's lay this out for the listener. There was a woman, Marion Keech, though Festinger, used a pseudonym in the book.
Right.
She convinced a group of followers that aliens from the planet Clarion had sent her a message.
It sounds absurd now, but they believed it.
The message was that a massive flood was going to destroy the world on December 21st. But the believers would be saved by a flying saucer at midnight.
Right. And these followers, known as the Seekers, completely committed to this.
They didn't just casually believe it.
No, they quit their jobs, they sold their homes, they gave away their life savings, they alienated their families.
Their entire identity and existence were fused with this prophecy.
Absolutely.
So the night of December 20th arrives. They're all sitting in the living room waiting. Midnight comes. No flying saucer. 12:05, nothing. 2 a.m., no flood, no aliens.
The clock is just ticking.
The sun rises on the 21st. The prophecy has demonstrably, unequivocally, 100% failed.
Undeniably.
Now, common sense dictates that at 6 a.m., these people would say, wow, we were wrong. We look ridiculous. Time to go get our jobs back.
Right. That's what a rational person might expect.
But they didn't. The research says the failure of the prophecy made them more convinced.
Yes. It intensified their proselytizing. They started calling newspapers, trying to spread their message more aggressively than before.
But this defies all logic. If the world didn't end, the prophecy was wrong.
Objectively wrong.
How does a failed prophecy physically result in stronger conviction? It's like doubling down on a terrible bet at a blackjack table just because you've already lost your mortgage on it.
It's exactly like that.
It's the sunk cost fallacy, but playing out on a deeply spiritual, existential level.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the sunk cost fallacy. Let's unpack the mechanics of cognitive dissonance here.
Please do.
Cognitive dissonance is the intense psychological pain caused by holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously.
Right?
So on one hand, I am a smart, rational person, and on the other hand, I just gave away my house because I thought a UFO was coming.
That's a massive contradiction.
Imagine the psychological devastation of admitting you were wrong about this.
Yeah.
Your ego, your identity, your social standing, everything is wrapped up in this belief.
It would ruin you.
If you admit you were wrong, the psychological collapse would be unbearable. It would break you.
So the brain refuses to process the collapse.
Yeah.
It literally builds an alternate reality to save itself.
The human mind is an absolute master of self-preservation.
It's incredible.
It will completely reorganize facts to protect the established worldview and shield the ego. So, when the sun rises on Wednesday morning, the believer doesn't say, "We were wrong."
What do they say?
The leader of the group receives a new message. And this message says, because this little group sat all night and spread so much light, God has decided to save the world.
Oh my goodness.
The dissonance is resolved not by accepting reality, but by inventing a new reality that allows them to keep their identity intact.
It didn't fail.
They saved humanity. And because they survived this ultimate test of faith, their conviction grows infinitely stronger.
That is deeply unsettling because it implies that facts, cold, hard, verifiable facts, are completely powerless against a belief that is tied to someone's identity.
Often, yes.
You can't just hand someone a brochure of facts and expect them to change their mind. You're not asking them to change their opinion. You're asking them to dismantle their own ego.
Which is exactly why arguing purely with logic and data in those deeply polarized situations is often completely ineffective.
And sometimes counterproductive, right?
Yes. The facts just trigger the amygdala's defense mechanism further. You are perceived as an attacker, and they pull the drawbridge up.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, a little offensive to those of us who pride ourselves on being educated.
Uh-oh.
If you're listening to a deep dives like this, you likely consider yourself a thinker. One might assume that being highly intelligent, having advanced degrees, being a critical thinker by trade, would protect you from these traps.
It's a very common assumption.
You'd think smart people would spot cognitive dissonance and groupthink from a mile away. But the data explicitly warns that the exact opposite is true. Let's talk about the intelligence paradox.
This is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding in behavioral science.
It really is.
The paradox that smarter people can be significantly more vulnerable to these exact psychological traps.
I need you to explain this, because shouldn't education and high IQ naturally breed critical thinking?
You would hope.
Doesn't knowing more things make you better at evaluating truth? Why does the research argue that smarts just turn people into better rationalizers of bad behavior?
Because we often conflate intelligence with objective truth-seeking, and they are not the same thing.
Okay.
High intelligence is essentially a very powerful processing engine. Think of it like a massive supercomputer.
Right.
If you point that supercomputer toward finding the objective truth, it is incredibly effective.
Makes sense.
But if your subconscious goal is to protect your identity, to obey authority, or to maintain your lucrative status in a corporate hierarchy, you will point that powerful engine toward rationalization.
So a smarter person just has a bigger vocabulary and better statistical models to defend a terrible idea.
Exactly. The data shows they are vastly better at rationalizing decisions.
Wow.
And they tend to use their intellect to defend their pre-existing conclusions rather than question them.
So they're just building a stronger fort.
Right. If a less intelligent person holds a flawed belief, they might struggle to defend it when challenged. They might run out of arguments and eventually concede.
Because they can't think of anything else to say.
Exactly.
Right.
But a highly intelligent person, they can instantly generate a dozen sophisticated, complex-sounding arguments to justify why they are actually right.
They can spin it.
They weave a brilliant web of logic that protects the core delusion. They don't use their intelligence to break out of the prison.
They use it to build stronger, taller intellectual walls around their bad conclusions.
Yes.
The prime case study for this, which illustrates it perfectly, is the collapse of Enron.
A perfect example.
You look at Enron in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it wasn't run by a bunch of uneducated grifters who didn't know basic math.
No, not at all.
These were famously dubbed the smartest guys in the room. Jeffrey Skilling, Ken Lay, Andrew Fastow. Highly educated professionals, MBAs from Harvard and Stanford.
The elite.
People who were explicitly trained their entire lives to analyze complex financial data and assess risk. And yet, they built and participated in one of the most massive historic frauds in corporate history.
If we look closely at the Enron culture, it wasn't just individual moral failure, it was a systemic environment that weaponized high intelligence.
How so?
Doubt was actively discouraged, extreme loyalty and aggressive compliance were rewarded with massive bonuses.
Right. So if you're a brilliant, newly minted MBA working in Enron's accounting department,
You're under a lot of pressure.
and you see something structurally, legally wrong with how they're using mark-to-market accounting to claim future unrealized profits as current income.
Right, a huge red flag.
Your intelligence isn't used to say, stop the presses, this is illegal. Your intelligence is co-opted by the system.
Yes.
You use your brilliance to design special purpose entities, these convoluted offshore shell companies with names like Jedi and Chuko, specifically to hide the company's massive debt.
You create the loophole.
You use your genius to make the fraud so mathematically complicated that no outside regulator can even understand it.
Precisely. The corporate culture demands obedience and tribal loyalty.
The two mechanisms we just discussed.
Exactly. And the individual uses their immense intelligence not to challenge the corrupt system, but to navigate it successfully,
To climb the ladder.
to rise within it,
Yeah.
and to mathematically justify their participation in it. And over time, as the complexity grows, the wrongdoing just feels like standard operating procedure.
It just becomes the day-to-day.
It feels completely normal.
Normal. That's the scary word. Normalization. Because Enron didn't start on day one with a massive multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme.
Oh, it took years.
And Eichmann didn't start on day one organizing atrocities. The normalization of catastrophic harm doesn't happen overnight.
It's a process.
It requires a specific environment and a slow, almost imperceptible descent. Let's look at how people actually slide into this.
The behavioral experts stress that the process of becoming complicit in harm almost never feels dramatic. There is no cinematic Darth Vader moment of choosing the dark side. It happens through very quiet, small, incremental steps.
I used to think of this like the old frog in boiling water cliche.
Sure.
But honestly, a better analogy is spatial disorientation in an airplane pilot.
Oh, that's interesting.
Sometimes a pilot flying in heavy clouds loses sight of the horizon. Their inner ear, their biological balancing system gets completely confused by the G-forces.
They lose their bearings.
They might be slowly, incrementally banking the plane toward the ground. But to their brain, it feels like they're flying perfectly straight and level.
Whoa.
By the time they break through the clouds and see the ground rushing at them, it's too late. The changes in pitch were so gradual that their internal alarms never went off.
That is a terrifying image.
We are applying that biological failing to our moral compass. Nobody wakes up on a Tuesday and says, I'm going to permanently stop asking if things are right today. I'm going to embrace complicity.
Right.
It's a passive failing.
That pilot analogy captures the danger of the quiet, gradual drift perfectly. Your moral inner ear gets disoriented.
Exactly.
The research breaks this downward drift into 3 specific progressive behavioral steps.
What's the first one?
First, deferring decisions to authority. Second, aligning with group norms. Third, avoiding uncomfortable questions entirely.
Let's walk through those, starting with deferring decisions to authority. We talked about this with the instrument state. It's those micro moments of passing the buck.
Yes, it starts incredibly small. You see a minor ethical breach in the workplace.
Like what?
Maybe a colleague fudging an expense report. Or you hear a casually cruel, discriminatory joke in a social setting.
Something you'd normally just brush off.
Right. Instead of confronting it, which takes energy and social risk, you defer. You say, the manager will handle the report. Or, it's not my place to call out the joke, the host should do it.
You're just outsourcing the problem.
You subtly train your brain that you are not the moral arbiter of your environment.
Then comes the second step, aligning with group norms.
This is the identity trap taking hold. You realize that the group tolerates, or perhaps even secretly encourages, these minor ethical breaches.
Right.
To maintain your standing in the group, to not be seen as the annoying whistleblower or the buzzkill, you adjust your own behavior to match the new, slightly lower norm.
You adapt.
You force a laugh at the joke. You sign off on the slightly misleading quarterly report because everyone else is doing it.
And the third step, avoiding uncomfortable questions. This feels like the fatal blow, when the pilot is completely upside down but refuses to look at the instruments.
It is the fatal blow. Avoiding uncomfortable questions becomes a deeply ingrained habit.
Because it hurts to ask them.
Because, as we established, asking the critical question causes cognitive dissonance, which is physically painful.
Yeah.
So you learn to stop looking in the dark corners where you know the answers will hurt.
You just keep your head down.
You systematically, day by day, silence that inner moral voice.
Until the ultimate, foundational, critical question, is this right?
Yeah.
Completely vanishes from your vocabulary.
It's just gone.
It doesn't even occur to the person to ask it anymore. The moral muscle has completely atrophied from lack of use.
And that is the precise moment when the ordinary, everyday person is fully capable of committing extraordinary harm.
Not out of malice.
Not out of psychopathic malice, but out of a complete systemic absence of moral reflection.
So if we are naturally wired by evolution to obey authority,
Yes.
if our biology demands group loyalty to survive,
Right.
if cognitive dissonance forces us to reject reality to protect our egos,
Exactly.
if our own intelligence just helps us rationalize our bad behavior, and if the drift into wrongdoing is so quiet and subtle that our internal alarms never sound.
It's a bleak picture.
My goodness. It feels entirely hopeless. Are we all just sitting ducks for moral collapse? Is it inevitable?
It feels like it.
But the philosophical and behavioral work we are looking at does offer a cure. It offers a very specific, daily, and frankly, highly difficult antidote.
It does. It's not a magic pill. It's a practice. The antidote lies in Hannah Arendt's prescriptions for independent thinking.
So what does this actually look like for you and me? How do we practice this in our daily lives?
Yeah.
The research says the solution requires aggressively pausing and forcing yourself to ask 3 specific questions. Let's go through them. Question 1. Do I actually believe in what I'm doing?
This is the direct remedy for the instrument state and the Milgram effect.
Okay, how so?
It forces you to reclaim your individual agency. You cannot defer to authority if you are forcing yourself, in the quiet of your own mind, to answer whether you personally believe in the action.
Because you're addressing yourself directly.
Exactly. It demands that you step out of the passive role of the hammer and step back into the terrifying role of the human being holding it.
It forces you to take ownership of the pen. You can't say the boss made me do it if you acknowledge that your hand is moving the ink.
Right.
Question 2. Would I defend this outside my group? Now this one. This feels like the ultimate brutal stress test for any belief.
It is a brilliant, highly uncomfortable psychological tool. Asking, would I defend this outside my group, directly attacks the identity and group loyalty trap.
Because you're removing the safety net.
Yes. We often adopt beliefs or behaviors simply because they signal our allegiance to our tribe, whether that's a political party, a corporate culture, or a social clique.
Right.
But if you mentally transport that belief into a room full of strangers, or better yet, a room full of people from a rival group,
Oh, wow.
and you find that you are deeply embarrassed to defend it, or you realize you cannot logically defend it without relying on the specific insular jargon of your tribe.
Then you don't actually hold that belief because it's objectively true. You hold it because it's a membership card to your club.
Precisely.
Wow, I really want you, listening right now, to think about applying that to your own life today.
It's a tough exercise.
Take the strong political opinion you just posted online, or the aggressive corporate strategy you just agreed to in a Zoom meeting, and imagine having to explain and defend it at a dinner party with intelligent people who do not share your worldview.
You probably sweat a little.
If you cringe at the thought, or if you know your argument would immediately collapse without the echo chamber cheering you on, the data is telling you that your belief is fragile. It's built on groupthink, not independent thought.
Exactly. It breaks the echo chamber by simulating external scrutiny. And that natural vulnerability leads to the third and final question. Am I open to being wrong?
Which combats the cognitive dissonance loop. But the philosophy goes a step further than just asking the question internally.
Requires action.
It says one must actively, physically seek out opposing views, not to compromise, not to find some watered-down middle ground, and certainly not to agree with them, but specifically to prevent self-deception.
Yes.
I have to ask you, though. It's so easy to say we should seek opposing views. Every self-help guru says, listen to the other side.
It's a cliche at this point.
But how do we do that without just getting defensive? How do I listen to someone I fiercely disagree with without just using my intelligence engine to mentally dismantle their arguments while they're talking?
The key is in understanding the goal, to prevent self-deception.
Okay.
You are not seeking opposing views to be polite or democratic. You are not doing it to validate them.
Why are you doing it then?
You are doing it selfishly to test the structural integrity of your own mind. When you encounter a strong opposing view, you shouldn't be asking, how quickly can I defeat this argument?
Which is what we all normally do.
Right. You should be asking, what massive blind spot in my own thinking is this person exposing? What data are they looking at that I am ignoring?
You're using them as a mirror.
It is a structural, mechanical necessity to keep your critical thinking engine running to ensure that you are not falling into the peaceful, unthinking sleep of complicity.
The peaceful sleep of complicity. That brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing psychological revelation we have today.
The last piece of the puzzle.
Because if we fail to take this antidote, if we don't force those three questions, if we don't actively seek out friction to test our blind spots, we don't just become complicit in harm.
No, it goes further than that.
We arrive at what the researchers describe as a chilling, profound psychological state.
The final insight reveals that the most disturbing part of massive systemic moral failure isn't the wrongdoing itself.
What is it?
It is the overwhelming sense of peace people feel while they are doing it.
I really want us to sit with that concept for a moment. The peace people feel.
It's a heavy thought.
In our culture, we usually associate internal peace with goodness, with morality, with a clear, unburdened conscience. We associate peace with yoga, meditation, charity work.
Things that are healthy and positive.
The idea that you can achieve a profound, deep internal peace while committing evil acts, while actively participating in highly destructive behavior is absolutely terrifying.
It upends everything.
It upends everything we think we know about how our emotions are supposed to guide our morality. We expect bad people to be tortured by guilt.
We do expect that, but it's a fallacy. It is terrifying because it reveals that the feeling of peace is not a biological reward for doing good.
Then what is it?
It is simply the biological reward for the absence of internal conflict.
Oh, that makes so much sense, but it is incredibly bleak. Let's unpack that.
If we connect this back to everything we've explored today, the instrument state, doing things merely as part of the job,
right,
surrendering your agency to an authority figure, merging your personal identity with the tribal group, what do all of these psychological mechanisms have in common?
They remove the friction.
They completely remove the heavy, difficult, exhausting burden of making independent moral choices.
When you hand over the steering wheel, you don't have to navigate the treacherous road anymore. You don't have to watch for hazards. You can just look out the window, recline your seat, and relax.
Exactly. When someone fully successfully hands over their moral judgment to the system, they eliminate all internal conflict.
Because they've outsourced the decision.
Right. There is no guilt because the authority figure or the corporation is responsible. There is no doubt because the group provides absolute certainty.
Wow.
The result is a dark, artificial but very real feeling of peace. They can act entirely destructively, yet feel completely justified and internally calm because they have successfully shut down the very cognitive mechanisms that cause moral distress.
They've turned off the alarm system.
They have flatlined their moral heartbeat.
So feeling completely justified, feeling zero guilt, feeling totally at peace with your actions and your beliefs.
Right.
That isn't necessarily proof that you were on the right side of history.
Not at all.
It might actually be the final terminal symptom of a complete moral collapse.
It is the chilling peace of surrendered judgment.
Man, we have covered a tremendous amount of incredibly heavy, deeply important ground today. Let's take a breath and synthesize the journey we've just been on.
You've done a lot.
We started by completely shattering the myth of the obvious villain, realizing through Arndt's lens on Eichmann that the most dangerous acts aren't born from pure malice.
Right, but from ordinary people treating harm as simply part of the job, a shift to administrative morality.
We dug deep into the psychological traps that ensnare us. The obedience to authority seen in Milgram's agonizing shock experiments that turns us into mere instruments passing the buck.
We looked at the evolutionary fusion of belief and identity that makes questioning our in-group feel like a physical bear attack.
And we explored Festinger's doomsday cult, revealing how the cognitive dissonance loop forces us to literally invent new realities and double down on our delusions rather than suffer the ego death of admitting we were wrong.
We also unpacked the Enron paradox, discovering that high intelligence doesn't naturally protect us. It often operates as a supercomputer used merely to rationalize our complicity, building impenetrable fortresses around our bad decisions.
We tracked the anatomy of the gradual drift, how we slowly lose our moral horizon like a disoriented pilot through deferring, aligning, and avoiding.
Until the vital question, is this right, completely vanishes.
And finally, we looked at the vital daily practice of independent thought, forcing ourselves to ask if we truly believe our actions, testing if we defend them outside our tribe, and intentionally seeking out friction.
Just to prevent our own self-deception.
And avoid that terrifying, artificial piece of surrendered judgment. So, here's my direct challenge to you, listening right now. Take Arndt's 3 questions out into the wild this week.
Try it out.
Take them into your next staff meeting when a questionable, efficient policy is proposed. Take them into your late-night doom scrolling when you are consuming political content that makes you angry at the other side.
Take them into your group chats.
Yes, take them into your group chats when everyone is piling on a single opinion and it feels so good to just agree. Pause and ask, do I actually believe this? Would I defend this out loud in a room full of strangers? And am I truly open to the possibility that I might be completely wrong?
And as you carry those questions with you into your week, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to explore on your own. We've established that the ultimate symptom of surrendered moral judgment is a profound feeling of internal peace and total justification. So ask yourself this. What if that deep sense of unquestionable certainty you feel when your group all agrees on something isn't actually a sign that you are right,
But
but rather the loudest warning siren that you stopped thinking for yourself entirely?